remember learning in history class that the ancient Egyptians built their pyramids using only simple tools, ropes, and ramps? And that they fitted their stone blocks, weighing tons, so perfectly together that not even a sheet of paper could fit between them? However, many alternative researchers are skeptical of the official account and believe it is more likely that the inhabitants of antiquity possessed miraculous advanced technologies that exceed our modern imagination. At the same time, this groundbreaking knowledge is said to be deliberately concealed from the general public. But what evidence is there to support this controversial assumption? Do the pyramids really represent the oldest cover-up in history? And what actually happened when today's researchers tried to imitate the presumed construction techniques of the ancient Egyptians? Stay tuned until the end and find out with us. From a purely architectural point of view, the Egyptians did not do things by halves. On the contrary, when you look at the Colossi of Giza, you might think that the inhabitants of the past were rather obsessed with stone megalomania. And no other structure testifies to this as emphatically as the world-famous Pyramid of Cheops. After all, it was considered the tallest structure in the world for almost 4,000 years and consisted of around 2.65 million stone blocks. And we all know that these are not compact bricks in the classical sense, but massive components weighing an average of 2.5 tons. But that's not all. To construct the King's Chamber, rose granite blocks weighing up to 70 tons had to be hoisted to a dizzying height of 70 meters. How exactly these extreme loads were hoisted up and fitted precisely without the aid of modern construction machinery remains a mystery to this day. The same applies to the actual transport to the ancient construction site, because we should not forget that the material was sometimes hauled from quarries up to 800 kilometers away from the Giza Plateau. And yet, despite the lack of construction records, the Egyptians somehow managed to create a monument for eternity that is almost 147 meters high and boasts an almost ridiculously precise design. On the one hand, the four sides of the pyramids of Cheops are aligned exactly with the four cardinal directions. And on the other hand, the difference in their side length is less than 1,000th. But how, and this is probably the crucial question, were the Egyptians able to achieve this with the resources available to them? Well, when it comes to transportation, most conservative historians assume that the tons of cargo were transported across the Nile by ship. At first glance, this seems like a plausible approach, but there is a significant catch. Even the largest ancient Egyptian ships that have been rediscovered to date would never have been able to withstand such extreme loads. A telltale mistake? With regard to the actual processing, the prevailing opinion again points to the use of various hand tools. However, this is more of an established assumption than a historically proven fact. Ultimately, the question of how the Egyptians were able to drill and saw hard rock such as basalt and granite remains one of the most perplexing of all. This required a material that was at least as hard as quartz, and that was not the case with the officially assumed copper tools. And where copper tools alone are not sufficient, there is ultimately the idea that the ancient Egyptian workers used a clever combination. More specifically, this refers to a combination of copper saws and a mixture of water, gypsum, and quartz sand. And even if it may well have been possible to cut through the hard stone in this way, there is no question that it must have been an equally laborious and time-consuming method. With this knowledge in mind, the following question arises. Why would an ancient construction worker have to toil for hours or even days if a block was unusable anyway due to a mishap? To understand what this means, we need to take a closer look at a very specific stone block. On display at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, this block is said to be evidence of nothing less than a mistake. As is easy to see, the worker clearly misaligned his cut, rendering the block unusable. However, many viewers are skeptical in view of the astonishing length of the cut. Why did he continue sawing for so long? Did he really only notice his mistake so late in the process? Or does this simple stone mishap ultimately prove that the Egyptians were able to work their blocks much faster than is generally assumed? Well, that depends, of course, on who you ask. What is certain is that long-established researchers still do not want to know anything about any lost advanced technologies, and that the officially presumed construction techniques of the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire have already been subjected to a number of practical tests. In one of these, two men equipped with a simple saw set about tackling a typical stone block and made a whole 4 millimeters per hour of progress through the material. And if we come back to the museum block, the question automatically arises as to how many hours the Egyptians had to continue sawing before they realized they had made a mistake. The sobering practical tests. However, the crookedly cut stone is not the only puzzling exhibit that catches our eye in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Here we can also marvel at a variety of contemporary tools that only serve to make the ancient Egyptians even more mysterious. In fact, this archaeological collection of chisels, small hand saws, and other tools is the only known example of the types of tools used by ancient Egyptian workers. But before we misunderstand each other, the museum pieces by no means include all the tools that have been found so far, but they do include all known types. But that's not all. Of all the countless hieroglyphic texts that have been found and deciphered, not a single one reveals how the Egyptians worked stone or built the pyramids. The bottom line is that the widespread depictions of seemingly endless columns of workers on the Giza Plateau are nothing more than theoretical illustrations. The illustrations that could not withstand practical implementation, because while modern researchers worked on the stone blocks for days with the presumed hammers and chisel, they hardly left a dent in the hard material. The wear and tear on the soft copper chisels was exceptionally high, and as a rule, they were unusable after just a few dozen blows. And so it came to pass that the men were ultimately forced to abandon their experiment and resort to chainsaws instead. However, the chisels had already failed when working on limestone, so it's hardly surprising that the result was even more sobering in the cases of the much harder granite. This time, instead of the rock, it was the tool itself that fell apart into pieces. Despite this, and somewhat surprisingly, the prevailing doctrine remains unchanged. Experts still maintain that these were the tools that the ancient Egyptians possessed and used to shape their stone blocks into the desired forms. After all, as mentioned above, these are the only types of tools that have ever been brought to light from the era of the pharaohs. These include saws, yet the only known depictions of this show the Egyptians using small hand saws to cut wood for furniture. We have already touched on what happens when a copper saw hits rock, and in the end, it took the Egyptologists several days to cut a few centimeters deep into the material. But how long must it have taken 4,500 years ago to completely work on a stone block? And just to remind you, the Pyramid of Cheops consists of 2.65 million blocks and is said to have been built within 20 years. But that also means that the workers had to cut, chisel, and move a stone block within minutes. Furthermore, we must not forget that the Pyramid of Cheops is not an isolated case. There are over 100 other pyramids in Egypt, each of which is said to have been built within a tight time frame in honor of the respective pharaoh. The controversial assumptions of alternative researchers. But if we simply entertain the idea that the pyramids were ultimately not created with primitive hammers and chisels, the question inevitably arises as to how they were built. Well, conveniently, there are a few alternative approaches to this, and by that we mean really alternative approaches. The premise is that everything we learned in history class is wrong, assuming that the legendary Hall of Records is hidden under the Giza Plateau. This would be an ancient library that testifies to the existence of a long-forgotten, pre-Egyptian advanced civilization. And to get there, one would only have to walk through the hidden tunnel that slumbers beneath the paws of the Sphinx. Apart from the fact that neither such a tunnel nor a wondrous library has ever officially been found, this mysterious precursor culture is said to have had a direct influence on the ancient Egyptians. And the technological marvels that grew out of the revealed knowledge are said to have made the construction of the magnificent buildings of Giza possible in the first place. In addition to the failed practical tests, there are some telltale depictions that are said to reveal the true technological status of the Egyptians. These include, in particular, the so-called light bulbs of Dendera, which depict nothing less than fully functioning electric lamps. However, the conservative counterparty recognizes in the reliefs in the Hathor temple only the god Harsomptis in the womb of the sky goddess Nut. But assuming that they really did exist, how did the exotic technologies of antiquity work in detail? Well, Even among alternative thinkers, there is no consensus on this. The common consensus is simply that they were very different from their modern counterparts. One approach is based on ancient Egyptian traditions that tell of priests singing while the massive pyramid blocks were being maneuvered into place. Against this background, some conclude that the Egyptians probably used some kind of sound-based technology. After all, there is no question that sound waves can cause matter to vibrate or even affect its physical properties. And if you click on the physical properties of the subscribe button now, you'll never miss another video from us. See you soon!